Thank you. We live in a closely integrated world where what one person, one firm, one country does affects others, sometimes for the better, often for the worse. In the age of globalization, social phenomena and business endeavors of any significant scale are never just local in scope. There is no longer any credibility, if there ever was, to the interpretation of Adam Smith's idea that suggests firms' pursuit of self-interest leads, as if by an invisible hand, to the well-being of society. Not even Adam Smith really believed that, but certainly no one today should. Banks' unbridled greed led the global economy to the brink of ruin. Unchecked exploitation of natural resources and the burning of fossil fuels has pushed our planet to the brink of environmental catastrophe. To protect our planet, to protect our society, rely on two things. On the one side, we need government regulations to prevent abuses. But we also need more. Individuals and corporations must broaden their understanding of self-interest. The Earth's most privileged individuals and societies will not remain forever insulated from consequences. It is in everyone's interest, even the richest 1%, that our planet thrive, that the divide between the haves and the have-nots not be too excessive. For firms, this entails corporate responsibility, going beyond the minimum required by the law to protect the environment, to treat workers with decency and fairness, not to exploit all the advantages that asymmetries in bargaining might afford. And it entails advocating for legal frameworks that protect labor and that protect the environment from less responsible firms. Some firms have done an outstanding job, and some firms have excelled in the opposite direction. Take finance. Leading up to the global crisis, some financial firms actually did what they were supposed to. Some financial firms actually managed risk and allocated capital where it was needed most. Others engaged in predatory lending, excessive risk-taking, active discrimination, insider trading, anti-competitive practices, and fraudulent behavior. Some of these firms have been caught, but many others have managed to barely stay within a flawed legal framework, which they helped design through lobbying and other activities to give them enormous latitude for exploitive practices. When I look at the finalists in this year's Public Eye Awards, two things immediately strike me. For one, it is remarkable how ubiquitous some of the firms with the most deplorable practices are in contemporary life. This year's nominees are companies in fields as diverse as finance, energy, mining, and electronics. Any of you who pick up the newspaper will see that there are many other firms that could have joined this list. Even the most socially aware consumer would be hard-pressed to avoid buying their products and services, directly or indirectly. This emphasizes the need for better legal frameworks, as well as the importance of efforts like these awards, which use shame to compel better voluntary behavior. The second thing that strikes me, and this is quite depressing, is what stiff competition this year's nominees faced. Though I was not on the selection committee, I could think of many other candidates in a range of industries that I think would qualify for the top listing in this dishonored role. So the lesson of the 2012 Public Eye Awards should be this. With these nominations, some of the worst examples of corporate irresponsibility in the last year have been identified. What is needed is not just a recognition of what is wrong with, say, their environmental and labor practices, but systemic improvements to incentive structures, to legal frameworks, and to our expectations and demands of corporations as global citizens. Only then can we hope to see a world where sustainable and equitable business practices are the norm and not the exception. I want to end on a positive note. Markets and corporations, as I said before, have demonstrated their enormous powers. In recent decades, they have been responsible for enormous advances in technology. Of the scale and scope of what has been accomplished is beyond, I think, what was conceivable a century ago. They have succeeded, for instance, in increasing GDP, but that GDP has not been widely shared. I've seen evidence in other contexts where pressure of the kind that these awards exemplify have succeeded in changing behavior. In some aspects of the textile industry, they have succeeded. And I hope that these awards are seen in this positive note, in the confidence that there are people who want to see the kind of responsible behavior become a systematic, more systemic within our economy. There's a second note I want to raise, and that is in the context of the bailouts, the Great Recession of 2008, the massive bailouts of the financial sector. The public has wound up owning large shares of many corporations, and including those in the financial sector. The public provided enormous assistance to most of the banks in the advanced industrial countries. And it is, I think, should be viewed as unacceptable that those who have received such assistance behave in ways that are so irresponsible. One example that I've written about very extensively is that in the aftermath of giving all the money to the banks, we didn't put any conditions on them to change their behavior, to stop their predatory lending, to stop their anti-competitive practices, to stop their credit card abuses, or even to reform the compensation schemes which had led to the excessive risk-taking and the short-sighted behavior. So the public gave all this money and didn't ask anything in return. One might have hoped that the executives of these corporations would have felt some social responsibility. The public has given us money, and in return, we ought to act in a more socially responsible way. I found it extraordinarily disturbing that so many of the banks have not responded in the way that had been hoped. And let me just mention one example in the United States, the foreclosure process, in which hundreds of thousands of Americans are losing their homes. 7 million, in fact, altogether have lost their home by some estimates since the recession, since the bubble broke. The banks circumvented the rule of law, which is the basic principles by which our society works. They even threw people out of their homes who did not owe any money. They engaged in this process called robo-signing, where they signed affidavits saying that they had examined whether the person had in fact owed the money, but they hadn't examined the records. They may have said, well, on average, people who were thrown out of the homes, most of them owed money. But that's like saying most of the people that we execute in our criminal prosecutions are guilty. That's not the standard of Western of justice. We don't say, we say you're innocent until you're proven guilty, and the fact is that we don't believe you should execute people who are innocent. And yet the attitude of the banks is that they've thrown out of people out of their homes. They engage in these practices. Even banks that received billions and billions of public money. The state attorney of Massachusetts, I think, put it very well. He said, the banks may be too big to fail, but they're not too big to be held accountable. And I think these awards are in a way saying that major corporations around the world are not too big to be held accountable in the court of public opinion. And I hope that these awards will raise consciousness of some of the kinds of worst practices that are going on in the world today. Thank you.
We certainly hope raising consciousness is one of the things that we can achieve. I would now take, and may I ask, Simon, ask you in the audience, we take 3 questions to Professor Stiglitz, and I'm fully aware that there's supposedly heated debates on the euro at the WEF, but please, if you can channel your questions to the issues addressed today at the Public Eye Awards, we would appreciate that. And please identify yourself and maybe even stand up so we can better see who's speaking. 3 questions, the gentleman on that.
Hi, thank you. I'm Tony Ganser with World Radio Switzerland. You talked about awards like this perhaps putting pressure on corporations in the realm of public opinion, but it seems like they've lost that in many respects, especially in the wake of the crisis, but real reform is still very slow going. So can you talk a little more about what needs to be a further catalyst to real change in addition to public outcry, perhaps?
You want me to answer? Okay. Well, I mean, you're right that real reforms, for instance, in the financial sector have been disappointing. I think we shouldn't underestimate that there have been some reforms, but I think there's broad consensus in America. 75% opinion polls suggest that 75% of Americans believe that the reforms have not gone far enough. If you look at some of the instability that we're seeing in financial markets, it's clear that there have been inadequate moves increasing transparency. One of the problems is we don't know exactly what the financial position of the different firms are. And so when there's a disturbance, nobody knows which firms are adequately financed, and the credit markets freeze. There's a broad consensus that we have not adequately recapitalized the banks. They are resisting pressures to make sure that they have adequate capital. They obviously, like the old regime where losses are socialized and profits are privatized, and it's a heads I win, tails you lose. There is Basel III is a move in the right direction, very slow, and probably almost surely not enough. So the question you ask is a good question. Why hasn't there been more? I think there are 2 reasons. One is I think that the political process, the democratic process, obviously has in many Western countries, in the United States included, is flawed. It's a system where lobbying, money, has a great deal of influence. And it's been made worse by the decision in the United States of Citizens United, where corporations are treated as if they were individuals, but they're individuals without the responsibilities and without the accountability. So they can engage in these kinds of practices, and then each individual says, it wasn't me, it was the corporation. So the unbridled spending has really distorted the process, the political process. So, as I sometimes jokingly said, the vast majority of Americans, we were roughly balanced in our political debate, about 10 banks on the one hand and 350 million Americans on the other, and it was a rough balance of equal power. Well, obviously that has to change, but it is also the case that in the financial area, the issues are complex, and the financial sector deliberately tries to make them more complex than they need to be. They try to argue that only we are the experts, only those in the financial sector, i.e. only those who have a self-interest are the only ones who can speak on the matter. And the result of this is that the public debate itself is probably unbalanced. So I think the reason we got as much done as we did was that there was active civil society movement in the United States and in some other countries. And I think, so the answer is, in part, political reform, but also a more active civil society.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Professor Stiglitz. Next question.
Thank you for this opportunity. Hi, my name is Hiro Maegawa. I'm a Japanese correspondent based in Geneva, working for the Asahi Shimbun, Japanese newspaper. And my question goes to Mr. Stiglitz on the TEPCO. I saw the company, Japanese company, on the list, and it's the major company. It's one of the. It's, of course, everybody knows that we had a major disaster last year, and even though the disaster was caused by the natural disaster, right? In terms of nuclear disaster that the TEPCO was involved, I suppose there are some kind of human aspect that we could have done better. So in this context, I'd like to ask from accountability or the responsibility that the TEPCO has, or what's your thought and on how well or how bad the TEPCO has done in this field? Thank you.
Well, let me first try to put this in a slightly broader context. There is almost no nuclear power plant in the world that bears the full consequences for its actions. Governments around the world have said that if there's a nuclear disaster, a blow-up, the companies will not bear the full cost. They have been given, in effect, limited liability for their actions. One of the reasons is that in the absence of that, there probably wouldn't be any nuclear industry. So, in a sense, the whole creation of the nuclear industry has been a result of a public subsidy of bearing some of the risk. There's another hidden public subsidy in the nuclear industry, which is what we deal with the spent fuel. We don't know where we're going to put it. Nobody wants it, and the likelihood is it's going to be very expensive to deal with it. So the fact that we haven't really forced the companies to bear the full cost of dealing with the spent fuel is another implicit subsidy. So the nuclear industry is basically very heavily subsidized, but in a way that's not transparent, because we've absorbed the risk. And in a way, there's a little bit of an analogy, and I've written an article about the analogy between the nuclear industry and the banking industry. In both of them, we created legal frameworks, in effect, where society absorbed the losses and they got the profits. Now, one of the consequences of that most economists would say is incentives matter. And if you have bad incentive structures, you should not be surprised that you get bad behavior. We did the same thing, by the way, in a third industry, in the oil drilling industry, where at least some of the legal framework suggested that those who were drilling for oil in the offshore might not bear the full cost of their actions if things went bad. So again, what we've seen in each of these instances is that we created incentive structures where the losses are publicly borne, the profits are absorbed by the private actors. And that's not market capitalism. That's a distorted, I call that ersatz capitalism. It's a distorted market economy, and you get distorted incentives and you get bad behavior. So we should not be surprised. And so when we look at what BP did, when we look at what the banks did, when we look at what TEPCO did, what we see is that it didn't take adequate care. Some of the things it did, when you look at the way where it stored the spent fuel, you look at some of the practices, you look at this and you say, how could they get away with that? How could they do that? And you look at, but then you understand, well, maybe they didn't have enough incentives to do the right thing. And in both cases, interesting, both in the banks and in the case of TEPCO, there had evidently been warnings about the risk, but they had incentives not to hear the advice. And so they didn't. One other aspect of all of this is there is a public role of regulators in each of these areas, and in each of these areas, the regulators failed. The public has often been criticized, the regulators have been criticized as causing the crisis. And let me make it clear, they didn't cause these crises, but they failed to do their job. And one of the reasons they failed to do their job is this phenomena that is extensively written about in the literature called regulatory capture. Sometimes the regulatory capture is what we call cognitive capture. They adopted the mindset. Sometimes it's because they come from the industry. Sometimes it's because of revolving doors, and they have actually pecuniary incentives that are distorted. But the bottom line out of all of these instances is that our regulatory systems have not worked adequately in each of these areas. And I hope the lesson from all of this is that we need more corporate responsibility. That was the theme. But we also need stronger, better regulations. And as we design our regulatory framework, we have to be aware of the dangers of this regulatory capture, which we've seen in industry after industry.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. The third question before we continue. I see one hand at the rear end. The microphone's on the way.
Thank you, Martin Benedict from the Associated Press. Professor, may I ask you, by handing out this award to Barclays and Vail, what is the message that you are giving to the leaders of the business chiefs at the Davos meeting just a few hundred meters away?
Well, I think the message is that they haven't played as constructive role as they could have played. That in some areas they've actually been quite bad. These are large organizations, and by pointing out what they've done wrong, that doesn't take away from the fact that they've done some things right as well. So this is not a condemnation and said they've done everything wrong. What it's saying is you've done something wrong, and something that's really you ought to think about. And you ought to be engaging in a discussion about, are these appropriate behaviors? And you know, I mentioned, for instance, in the context of the banks in the United States, their foreclosure process that has gotten so much attention. You would have thought that the attention that was given to that would have led them to a quick settlement and let's get that behind. But what we saw in the United States is that for over a year they negotiated with the state attorney generals as if they were totally unembarrassed by the robo-signing, their fraudulent practices. These are large organizations, let me say, and one of the problems of large organizations is it's very hard to control them. Somebody on one side is doing something quite good, and somebody on the other side may be doing something not so good, quite bad. And what we're saying is you have to really get control mechanisms in place so that you make sure that as long as, you should advertise your good things, but you should also be held accountable for some of the adverse things that you are doing. And that when they are pointed out, don't be defensive. Don't say we didn't do it. But to say, we are large organizations and humans are fallible. We are going to work to get better control systems. Robo-signing was wrong, and we ought to pay a high price. The same thing. To give you one more example, and Bank America signed this, paid this multi-million, several $100 million fine for discriminatory lending practices. You know, these are major banks. A few weeks ago, we celebrated Martin Luther King birthday, and we talk about how we're fighting discrimination, and to find America's largest bank as engaged in discriminatory practices should be very disturbing. And again, to say, you know, the typical settlement of these, the SEC fraud charges, we neither admit nor deny guilt, but we're just paying a couple $100 million because we want things to go away. That's not an adequate response. And it's interesting, just to go on a little bit, one of the judges in New York said to the SEC, you can no longer do that. If they're guilty, they ought to admit being guilty. And unfortunately, too many of the cases, the corporations will say that we neither admit or guilt, we'll just pay you a few $100 million as if you pay that amount of money just because somebody suggested you might have done something wrong.
Thank you.